bourgeoisie produces, above all, art zone. Gravediggers.
Hi, everyone.
Hey, folks, we're back after a long time.
Syria, it's finally here.
No controversy, definitely not going to be any issues. It's going to be very pleasant, very agreeable episode.
We are so sorry about the missing episodes these past couple weeks. I was unbelievably overwhelmed, and I still am in many ways, but getting better. I don't want to get into personal things, but the situation will improve. And we have a very, very long and exciting episode for you.
Yeah, so without further ado, we should just dip into it.
We want to give a quick note here. We always include a link to our sources in the episode description. We've compiled all bibliographies in a single document so that listeners can easily view all our source material for series like our Arab Uprisings in one place, without flipping through episodes on your app. Now, a large part of today's episode will be a discussion about primary sources, so we want to emphasize at the top that we always include our source material for you to peruse. If you think some of the sources we reference aren't reliable, or you think we've left out a crucial perspective on any topic, tell us. We're really happy to receive constructive criticism on Patreon or Instagram. We're also eager to answer questions about putting our episodes together and why we chose specific sources or quotes. Of course, we are human beings and we know that we are fallible. We take fact-checking very seriously, but we are two amateurs, not an international news organization, so we depend on listeners to let us know if you think we make a mistake.
What's this we stuff all of a sudden? I am the objective source of truth. Anything I say is by definition correct.
Exactly. In the spring of 2011, anti-government protests spread across the Middle East and North Africa, soon reaching Syria, a country with a population of about 22 million at the time. Unlike the mass demonstrations in Tunisia, those in Syria began not with an act of self-immolation, but with a government arrest, as a dozen teenagers in the southern Syrian city of Daraa were picked up and tortured by government forces for anti-regime graffiti. This wouldn't be the only significant arrest during the Syrian uprising, later reclassified as the now decade-long Syrian Civil War. Syrian writer Ali al-Abdallah, Communist Party member Abbas, and human rights campaigners Loe Hussein were all detained by government forces in the spring of 2011.
It's interesting to see how Syria reacted to the spreading protests. I suppose by this point, Assad saw the effects of those protests on Mubarak and Ben Ali and decided it was safer to overreact than not. And I suppose in a way, he calculated correctly since he remains one of the last pre-2011 incumbents standing.
On June 6, 2011, Syrian-American blogger Amina Abdallah Arraf Omari, known for her webpage about being a lesbian in Syria titled A Gay Girl in Damascus, was reported to have been abducted by two men who appeared to be Syrian government forces. International media outlets like The Guardian picked up the story, and well-meaning LGBT activists worldwide began to organize to support her release. But as with so many threads that make up the complex web of the Syrian Civil War, Amina's arrest and the spotlight it put on her blog began to demand more explanation. Who is Amina? What happened? And why is this story so important to our understanding of the Syrian Civil War? To examine these 2011 arrests, we have to first look at Syria's situation and its history until that point. The last century has seen significant foreign intervention in Syria, so we need to explore what this has entailed and why Syria is vital to outside powers. Let's start with the close of World War I, around 1917-1918. Arab nationalists in Damascus seek to end Ottoman rule in Syria. Some collaborate with the British and French, leading to European mandates in the region, basically replacing Ottoman colonialism with British and French colonialism.
Okay, keep in mind that Syria was simultaneously promised by the British to both the French and the Arabs in the event of a World War I victory. So in the major case of Arabs collaborating with the British, they were collaborating under the false promise of being given independence. And then when the British, won World War I, they implemented the Sykes-Picot Agreement between them and the French, which divided the Middle East between French mandates and British mandates. The Hashemites, who were the biggest tribe that was cooperating with the British, and at the time was led by Sharif Hussein's son and the future king of Iraq, King Faisal, invaded Syria in an effort to establish an Arab kingdom by force. They were expelled by the French, who controlled Syria until after World War II.
Syria gained independence in 1946 and established a parliamentary system, though this was dominated by landlords, merchants, and other members of the upper class. In 1945, the Arabian-American Oil Company, or Aramco, announced plans to build the Tapline oil conduit from Saudi Arabia to the Mediterranean. 3 out of the 4 countries on the way, Jordan, Lebanon, and Saudi, of course, immediately agreed to the project. But Syria hesitated, seeking better terms in the agreement. Then, in 1947, Zionist militias began expelling Palestinians from their homes in anticipation of an independent Jewish state, eventually displacing 750,000 people in an act that even Israeli Jewish scholars like Ilan Pappé refer to as ethnic cleansing. Surrounding Arab armies launched a war in response, but were woefully underarmed due to their recent colonial histories and independence uprisings, and corruption within their governments. After Syria's defeat, protesters in Damascus forced the government to resign, and the United States used this as an opportunity to foment an anti-communist coup. Their man on the inside, Colonel Hosni Zaim, claimed power in 1949. He enacted policies that favored U.S. interests, such as approving the Aramco pipeline, arresting communists or suspected communists en masse, and signing an armistice with Israel. Zaim was overthrown by another colonel, who was in turn overthrown by a third colonel. Syria cycled through leaders this way until finally, in November of 1970, Hafez al-Assad pulled a coup to end all coups. Hafez remained in power until his death in 2000, when his son, Bashar al-Assad, took his place. Syrians mostly expected Hafez's eldest son, Bassel, would succeed his father as president of Syria, but Bassel died in a car accident in 1994. It was then that Hafez's second-born son, ophthalmologist Bashar, was recalled to the Syrian army so he could train in politics.
Yeah, if Bassel is like the quintessential jock of the family, Bashar is definitely the nerd. Being the jock, Bassel al-Assad got killed driving a car at like unbelievable speed. So that ended up with Bashar on the Syrian throne, if you will, metaphorical throne. But to clarify, Syria was pretty much a merry-go-round of coups between 1949 and 1970. And it's also interesting to note that Hafez's brother and Bashar's uncle Rifat had been in charge of the internal security apparatus after 1970, called the defense companies. And in 1983, when Hafez was dealing with heart issues, Rifat attempted a coup that failed and led to him being exiled to France, where he lives today.
A real Cain and Abel situation there.
Yeah, definitely.
So, a claim often repeated about the Assad-led Syrian government and its opposition is that disagreements between them are principally informed by demographics or ethno-religious conflict. This is a severe misreading of Syria's situation, which downplays both the material conditions that led to the 2011 uprising and the history of intervention in the region. While the Assad family's core members are members of the Alawite community, it's not an exclusively Alawite family. For example, Bashar al-Assad's wife, Esma, is Sunni. More importantly, the Syrian bourgeoisie consists of people from many different sects, including Sunnis. Syria has a cliquish elite, indeed, but not all its members are Alawite. The Sunni urban bourgeoisie, in particular, has a vested interest in the continuation of the Assad government in Syria.
Yeah, in fact, Hafez al-Assad succeeded in his 1970 coup largely due to his alliance with the Syrian urban bourgeoisie, most, if not all of whom were Sunni. They were livid at the then-incumbent Salah Jadid's radical socialist policies. Jadid basically took Baathism down a sort of proto-Maoist line, including land reform, collectivization, etc., etc. And while the military elite of the Assad Syria remained largely Alawite, the civilian and political administration rely largely on Sunni bourgeoisie. And this is clear, and we can talk about it later, in how the war played out, where Syrian upper and middle class used their wealth to flee, and most of the actual fighting was done by either foreign mercenaries or local urban gangs made up of very, disenfranchised and economically destitute Syrians.
Furthermore, as with the situation of the Houthis in Yemen, the Syrian and Iranian government's affinity isn't based on religious camaraderie. The Alawites in Syria don't have much in common with the beliefs and practices of the mainstream Twelver Shi'ism mostly practiced in Iran. We want to push back on the notion of Syria's conflict as a religious one. While there are undoubtedly religious extremists involved, most notably ISIS and al-Qaeda, divisions in Syria are also based on class and region. Furthermore, one of the tenets of Baathism, the ideology claimed by the Assad-led Syrian Arab Republic, is Arab nationalism. While this nationalism includes religious minorities in Syria who count themselves as Arabs, such as the Alawites and Christians, it excludes ethnic minorities like the Kurds. But my point here is that the Syrian Arab Republic intends to be just that, Arab in character, as opposed to Alawite or generally Shia.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting how Baathism as an ideology has been very appealing to various religious minorities in both Syria and Egypt. I mean, the founder of Baathism, Michel Aflaq, was himself a Syrian Christian. I just assume that, Baathism has a large appeal to religious minorities in the Middle East as an antidote to Islamism.
Right, and Arab nationalism in general, because if you are Arab, even if you're a religious minority, you're still in the Arab majority.
Yes, which is why also the converse of that is ethnic minorities that hold on to political Islamism, like Turkmen in Jordan and some conservative segments of Kurds who see themselves within an Islamist lens.
None of this is to say that these differences are utterly irrelevant to what's happening in Syria. Patrick Coburn writes on the 2011 protests in Daraa, quote, "The protests are the biggest domestic challenge to the Assad family since the early 1980s, when President Hafez al-Assad crushed a Sunni revolt centered on Hama, where at least 10,000 people were killed in 1982. The current protests are secular in tone, but Daraa and Hama are Sunni strongholds resentful of the influence of the Alawites, a heterodox Shia sect to which 12% of Syrians belong, including Assad and many members of the ruling elite." End quote. Coburn specifically refers to the Hama massacre, a 27-day siege of the town of Hama to quell an uprising led by the Muslim Brotherhood in Syria, a Sunni-led anti-government movement. The siege, commanded by Hafez al-Assad's brother Rafat, saw the massacre of between 2,000 and 20,000 people, primarily civilians. Above, Coburn places the figure at 10,000.
Yeah, I mean, Rafat claims him being exiled in France now, and I believe recently declassified docs may prove him right, that the massacre was largely organized by Hafez, but that being said, Rafat was definitely the field commander overseeing the operation. And, just following orders is not a viable excuse. Rafat, have you not heard of Nuremberg?
Though the Muslim Brotherhood didn't have widespread support in Syria at the time, Sunnis in cities like Aleppo and Damascus didn't rise up in solidarity, the army's siege of Hama didn't endear Syrians to the Assad family. Despite the Syrian army's decisive victory at Hama, the Syrian people didn't simply forget about what had happened, and Hama is often cited as an example of the Assad government's firm repression of opposition movements, especially Islamist ones. Agrarian reforms in particular saw the most adverse effects for Syrians in rural areas, many of whom happened to be Sunni. The shift from state farms to privately owned enterprises increased inequality and retraditionalized agrarian Syrian society, similar to Tunisia and Egypt's structural adjustments. As a result, many Syrians left the country looking for work. They found it in Lebanon, which Syria occupied in part until 2005 due to Lebanon's civil war. But when Syria withdrew from Lebanon and work visa requirements changed, many of these Syrian workers lost their jobs or were forced into more precarious work positions. Thus, the liberalization of Syria's economy has played a large part in social divisions.
Yeah, so agrarian reforms also combined with climate change to devastate the Syrian rural areas. Historic droughts in the mid-2000s led to massive crop failures and widespread collapse of farming, pushing many rural Syrians to move to cities looking for jobs. Unfortunately, those cities did not have the economic capacity to absorb these young Syrian men, and they were by and large men. And this influx ended up living in ghettos or in shanty towns in cities like Damascus, Aleppo, Hama, and Homs, with no economic prospect, and were absorbed easily into the Islamist opposition that appealed to their resentment.
This brings us to other social issues in Syria. As we mentioned at the top of this week's episode, our story concerns a Syrian LGBT blogger. Article 520 of Syria's Penal Code of 1949, which is still technically in effect, prohibits, quote, carnal relations against the order of nature, end quote, with a penalty of up to 3 years imprisonment. This effectively criminalizes homosexuality, though this doesn't mean that there aren't out and proud queer people living in places like Damascus. There are. We don't want to paint Syria or the entire region with a broad brush. Homophobia, transphobia, and violence against queer people is a massive problem in Arab countries, yes, but experiences vary and often overlap with other forms of oppression. Al-Qaz, meaning the Rainbow Network for Sexual and Gender Diversity in Palestinian Society, refers to, quote, the Israeli state's use of the language of gay and trans rights to direct international attention away from the oppression of Palestinians, end quote, as pinkwashing. We could extend this analysis to imperial powers disguising interventionist wars and policies as concern for the oppressed, namely women and queer people. Gargi Bhattacharya and Jasbir Puar describe this chauvinistic phenomenon in their books Dangerous Brown Men, Exploiting Sex, Violence, and Feminism in the War on Terror, and Terrorist Assemblages, Homo-Nationalism in Queer Times, respectively. This is all to say, it's challenging to confront problems like violence against women and LGBT people in the Middle East and North Africa, because imperial powers have used this oppression as an excuse for invasion and war. Queer people living in these places find themselves caught between a rock and a hard place. Righteous criticisms of their government's policies and demands for liberation have been appropriated as fodder for Western warmongers. We should condemn anti-LGBT violence anytime we see it, but we can do so while also denouncing powers that use liberal rhetoric about LGBT people as a shield for imperialist policies. We covered the imprisonment, torture, and subsequent suicide of Egyptian lesbian writer and activist Sarah Hagazi in episode 43 on Egypt's counter-revolution. The Egyptian regime's arrest and torture of Sarah Hagazi is, at least in my opinion, emblematic of how the state treats LGBT or queer people. So long as LGBT people remain invisible and don't challenge the status quo, they might be left alone. But if someone dares to criticize the regime, not even necessarily for its anti-LGBT policies, but for any social issue like corruption or hostility toward the working class, their queerness becomes yet another target for oppression and violence.
I think this is an apt place to mention that the Tunisian government had just arrested LGBTQ activist Rania Amdouni after she attempted to submit formal complaints of harassment by the police. And the harassment itself followed her work protesting corruption and political repression in Tunisia. And her LGBTQ identity was not an issue until she sort of ran up against the Tunisian government.
With this chunk of background information in mind, we can now embark on the story of the Syrian lesbian blogger Amina Abdallah Arraf al-Omari. Writers and analysts generally mark the beginning of Syria's uprising-turned-civil war, with protests in the southern city of Daraa in March 2011. These protests were a response to the Syrian police's arrest and alleged torture of a group of teenage boys, accused of graffitiing "Ash-Shab Yurid Iskat al-Nizam," the people want the fall of the regime, a slogan used by anti-government protesters around the Arab world. Protesters led by the boys' families demand their release, but become more radicalized against the Syrian government after security forces fire live ammunition, killing and wounding demonstrators. As we've seen across the board in our Arab Uprising series, the government's efforts to quell protests with violence have had the opposite effect, as increasing numbers of people join the demonstrations to show their opposition to that violence, and, concerningly in Syria, more and more extremist groups use the anti-government sentiments as a time to move on their own visions for Syria. In the early days of the uprisings, the Syrian government made concessions to the protesters, such as shortening mandatory army conscription, firing the governor of Daraa, and issuing a decree lifting Syria's nearly 50-year state of emergency that had granted significant power to the police. But as we saw in other states like Egypt and Tunisia, these reforms were too little too late for many protesters.
Yeah, one controversial concession that we will come back to in the future episodes is Syrian government's decision to release thousands of political prisoners from its jails. Now, many protesters and foreign, factions had demanded the release of those prisoners, but many of those prisoners were also radical Islamists who then formed Islamist factions in the subsequent war that would arrive. And some say Assad deliberately released those prisoners to allow them to hijack the uprising and thus position himself as the only force against a radical Islamist rebellion. I don't necessarily agree with that assessment because I think that's way too convoluted. And, with Occam's razor, the simplest is often the most believable. And with those Islamists, they definitely did take over the uprising and turn it towards a very definitive Islamist path.
This isn't the only episode we plan to do on Syria, so we aren't going to describe every demonstration in detail now, but as everyone listening likely knows, these protests and counter-protests would evolve into a decade-long civil war, which would include intervention by foreign powers and the rise of Islamist militant groups such as Al-Qaeda and ISIS. As the protests grew, so did the number of arrests. The number of arrests has been disputed, as we'll discuss in a moment, but there are two kinds of arrests associated with opposition protests. First, arrests at demonstrations. Security forces detain protesters during or immediately following an anti-government demonstration. Second, arrests at other times. Anti-government activists are arrested in their homes, jobs, or other places when they are not demonstrating. According to the UK-based Syrian Network for Human Rights, or SNHR, as many as 125,000 people arrested by the Syrian government security forces since 2011 remain missing. But the SNHR isn't without its critics. Max Blumenthal writes for the Grey Zone, quote, "The Syrian Network for Human Rights has a reputation for warping numbers to support its ulterior regime change agenda, while relentlessly downplaying the crimes of Salafi jihadist militias, including ISIS and Al-Qaeda's local affiliate, Jabhat al-Nusra." End quote. But Blumenthal and his colleagues at the Grey Zone have themselves been subjects of criticism, including accusations of Assad government apologia. Indeed, the uprising and civil war in Syria have become a flashpoint for disagreements within the Western left about the line between international solidarity and intervention.
Yeah, personally, I think that intervention must be opposed by any principled leftist or organized left, but I'm hesitant to conflate anti-interventionism with an outright approval of a given government. For example, if tomorrow, and I know this won't happen, but if tomorrow America decided to call for military intervention in Bahrain to overthrow the Bahraini royal family, and, I am very much against the Bahraini royal family, I wouldn't endorse America's intervention to do that because the question has to be asked who's intervening and what's in it for them. And if America is doing that, then there must have to be some sort of imperialist design behind that rationale. And there's also the difference between individuals volunteering for a principled leftist cause, like various people volunteering with the Kurds in northern Syria, and state-led intervention on behalf of a given faction, like American State Department and the Pentagon backing jihadis in Syria.
Speaking honestly here, and also very cynically, for every piece of journalism or commentary you find on Syria, you'll also find someone characterizing the writer as a hack, a shill, or an apologist for some government, be it the United States, Russia, or some other power with its fingers in the scalding pie that is the Syrian Civil War. I won't claim to be an expert on Syria, nor will I claim immunity from propaganda. We are all liable to be uncertain or confused, especially when different sources give us conflicting information. So when I encounter a statistic like the SNHR claim that 125,000 people have essentially been disappeared by the Assad-led Syrian government, I also look for corroborating sources or journalistic skepticism. But in the case of Syria, I then encounter skepticism about that skepticism, a revolving door of allegations of misinformation, shady financing, and regime apologia. Obtaining what should be a straightforward statistic, such as how many people have been arrested since 2011 and not yet released, becomes an exercise in sifting through slant piece after slant piece.
Yeah, so it's not difficult to imagine the Syrian government overreacting to a wave of uprisings in the region at a time and arresting people. For one, it's not the first time that same government engaged in mass arrests. And for another, it's pointing out said arrest isn't condoning intervention.
Right. It is inarguable that people were arrested and detained in 2011 in connection with protests or opposition to the government. A Human Rights Watch report dated May 15, 2011, cites human rights lawyer Catherine El-Tali, activist Mohammed Najati Tayara and Wael Hamida, and women's rights campaigner Malik El-Shanawani as people arrested by security forces on suspicion of inciting the uprising in 2011. Another such character was Amina Abdallah Arraf al-Omari, a Syrian-American lesbian and blogger under the banner A Gay Girl in Damascus. For months before the uprising, Amina wrote online about her experiences as a lesbian in the Syrian capital. Amina was born in Staunton, Virginia in October of 1975, making her 35 years old at the time of her arrest. She describes herself as both a lesbian and a devout Muslim, writing in a blog post on February 19, 2011, quote, "When I was 15, I realized I was gay, and the thought absolutely terrified me. I began covering my hair, which on the day that I started was dyed a brilliant shade of blue, and suddenly found an easier reason to turn aside malattention. I was religious, not uninterested because of my orientation. I joined an Islamic women's devotional group and had an older girl as a mentor. I was crazy about her. When we traveled, we would share a bed, and we'd walk hand in hand together. I was utterly devoted to her. I cried myself to sleep the day she told me she was getting married." End quote. Amina describes being married to a man in denial of her sexual orientation, but it didn't work out. As she grew older, she came to accept the truth about herself. She was a lesbian. As protests grew and the international gaze turned towards Syria, Amina's blog became more popular among Western news outlets, notably The Guardian based in London, with Catherine Marsh writing under the headline, quote, "A gay girl in Damascus becomes a heroine of the Syrian revolt." End quote.
I prefer people who become cocaine of the Syrian revolt, not heroin.
Oh, God. Amina represented a new Syria, accepting all people regardless of gender and sexual orientation. She also appealed to Western audiences because she was American and spoke perfect English. Amina even sent the manuscript for her autobiography to Indian-American queer activist Minal Hajratwala, requesting advice on seeking a publisher. Amina gave interviews via email to news organizations like CNN.
I think Amina also strongly appealed to the Western press because she does not address the Syrian revolt via the lens of imperialism and geopolitics. I mean, it's much easier to absorb a narrative like Amina's when it's mildly liberal, but lacks any radical analysis of the material conditions and doesn't propose a fundamentally antagonistic project that defies the US or NATO hegemony. Progressives in particular love the victim narrative of some collection of oppressed identities manifesting in a single person that defies a particular state.
Amina documented her experiences as a lesbian who had come out later in life and moved to a place where homosexuality was particularly taboo, but where she felt at home. Her blog resonated with queer Arabs and with Western LGBT people who felt ostracized by their communities. As demonstrations expanded in Syria, Amina became more critical of Assad's government, and, according to her blog, this caught up with her. In a post dated April 26, 2011, titled "My Father, the Hero," Amina describes her father's reaction when security forces visited the family's home in Damascus in the middle of the night, hoping to detain her. Quote, "You are Alawiyin, or Alawite. Do not deny that. I know you both are. We are Sunni. You know that. So you come here to take Amina. Let me tell you something, though. She is not the one you should fear. You should be heaping praises on her and people like her. They are the ones saying Alawi, Sunni, Arabi, Kurdi, Druzi, Christian. Everyone is the same and will be equal in the new Syria. They are the ones who, if the revolution comes, will be saving your mother and your sisters. They are the ones fighting the Wahhabi most seriously. You idiots are, though, serving them by saying, every Sunni is Salafi, every protester is Salafi, every one of them is an enemy, because when you do that, you make it so." End quote. However, this wouldn't be the last encounter with government forces for Amina. On June 6, 2011, Amina was kidnapped by men who appeared to be government agents or state-sponsored militia members, known colloquially as shabiha or ghosts. In a blog entry dated that same day, June 6, 2011, Amina's cousin writes, quote, "Dear friends of Amina, I am Amina Abdallah Arraf al-Omari's cousin and have the following information to share. Earlier today, at approximately 6 p.m. Damascus time, Amina was walking in the area of the Abbasid bus station near Faris al-Khoury Street. She had gone to meet a person involved with the local coordinating committee and was accompanied by a friend. Amina told the friend that she would go ahead, and they separated. Amina had, apparently, identified the person she was to meet. However, while her companion was still close by, Amina was seized by 3 men in their early 20s. According to the witness, who does not want her identity known, the men were armed. Amina hit one of them and told the friend to go find her father. One of the men then put his hand over Amina's mouth, and they hustled her into a red Dacia Logan with a window sticker of Bas al-Assad. The witness did not get the tag number. She promptly went and found Amina's father. The men are assumed to be members of one of the security forces or Ba'ath Party militia. Amina's present location is unknown, and it is unclear if she is in jail or being held somewhere in Damascus. I have just spoken with her father, who is trying to locate her. He has asked me to share this information with her contacts in the hope that someone may know her whereabouts, and so she might be shortly released. If she is now in custody, he is not worried about being in hiding and says he will do anything he can to free her. If anyone knows anything as to her whereabouts, please contact Abdallah Omari at his home, or please email me, Rania Ismail, at onepath2god@gmail.com. We are hoping she is simply in jail and nothing worse has happened to her. Amina had previously sent me several texts to post should something happen to her, and we will wait until we have definite word before doing so. Salamat, Rania O. Ismail. End quote.
Okay, just to pause for a second, it is so fucking funny to me that Amina had prepared plans to have someone post on her behalf should she experience anything that prevents her from posting. Because that's right there is a true poster. That's true poster mindset and dedication to posting online.
We should prepare some documents in the Google Drive for the podcast in case one of us is abducted by security forces.
Absolutely. I will post documents that you should tweet out in sequence and with time periods between them that you have to post if I'm ever disappeared.
QR codes?
Yeah, absolutely.
So Western media outlets immediately grabbed the story. A prominent lesbian activist, an American citizen no less, had apparently been abducted by Bashar al-Assad's security forces. LGBT rights groups in cities like London and New York urgently demanded Amina's release. A Facebook page called Free Amina Arraf gathered more than 10,000 followers in about 24 hours. They feared that as a woman and a lesbian, Amina was targeted and would be subjected to heinous torture by the Syrian government. The next day, June 7th, the U.S. State Department published that it was looking into Amina's abduction in Damascus. Activists around the world called for her release or, at the very least, information about her whereabouts and charges against her.
This is one of those things that I find fascinating because inevitably when these things happen, there's always a Facebook or Instagram page titled like Free So-and-so, and I don't understand what their purpose is because what does following or liking a page do in terms of affecting political power in a meaningful sense? Because somehow I doubt that A, social media pages influence the actions of any country, and B, it actively detracts from local organizing by supplanting political organizing with posting and the resulting sort of feel-good factor. So maybe I'm being a crank, but I really hate seeing people confuse posting and pages with political power and the execution thereof.
Oh, I completely agree with you.
Yeah, it's really frustrating.
As the clock ticked on, Amina's supporters became more concerned. People mobilized to try and free her from wherever she could be held, but were unable to get any answers about Amina or her family. Other LGBT activists and openly gay people in Syria also feared for their own safety. If Amina had been abducted, they could be next. After Amina's arrest, however, activists and journalists struggled to contact her family members and associates to garner more information. The day after Amina's kidnapping, June 7th, feminist and disability activist blogger Liz Henry posted a piece titled Painful Doubts About Amina, in which she contemplated, quote, "As the afternoon wore on, I felt that, even sluggish as it is, mainstream media should by now have found people who were personal friends, family, fellow students, or co-workers of Amina from her time in the US, if not contacts in Syria. Again, a day went by, and all the sources and quotes were from 2 blogs by the same person, about that person. Interviews surfaced, but they were all interviews by email. Then as I questioned things on my blogs and on Twitter, in some phone calls to activists and journalists, I saw that Amina's friend Sandra Bagaria in Montreal was twittering about her and was beginning to give interviews. She was reported as a close friend, girlfriend, and partner in different sources. Sandra Bagaria, unlike Amina, had a clear presence on the web. That put my fears partly to rest, but I wondered a bit about Bagaria's aliases. Her Twitter description read, AKA Marjane, AKA Lisbeth, and a Syrian lover. Really? End quote. Liz Henry continues about how upsetting it is for her to consider that Amina may not be authentic. Quote, I would hate to have my existence doubted, and I am finding it painful to continue doubting Amina's. If she is real, I am very sorry and will apologize and continue to work for her release and support. If this is a hoax, I feel for everyone involved whose emotions were brought to a pitch and who stepped up to try and support Amina Arraf. It also must be really infuriating for the LGBT people actually in Syria and for many other activists and bloggers who have been detained for their online writing. End quote. More news broke the following day, June 8, 2011, as Jelena Lecic, a Croatian national and employee at the Royal College of Physicians in London, came forward saying that the photographs of Amina on her blog were not actually images of the Syrian blogger, but of her, Jelena.
If someone used my photos as a stock for a manufactured character, I'd be fucking livid. Also, it shows how sociopathic the internet is that personal photos can just be taken to be used for whatever purposes. I mean, we really live in a brave new world over here.
Ms. Lecic told the BBC that she'd never been to Syria, nor met anyone named Amina, and that the use of the images, which she believed to have been stolen from her personal Facebook account, was upsetting to her. I'd imagine that would be very upsetting, like you just said.
Yeah, it would be very, very annoying and upsetting, and I would be very angry.
Then, on June 12, 2011, things came crashing down for Amina. Ali Abunimah and Benjamin Doherty of Electronic Intifada published a piece containing evidence that Amina was not a real person, but rather an American citizen living in Scotland by the name of Tom McMaster and perhaps his wife, Britta Frolicker. Their evidence was as follows. First, the images purportedly of Amina Arraf were actually photographs of Jelena Lecic. Second, Amina's home address, as documented through social media use, was the same as Tom McMaster's home address. Third, a photograph of an Assad billboard in Syria appears to match up with Britta Frolicker's Picasa account and is cropped in such a way that it must derive from the same original image. And finally, internet server IP addresses used by Amina appear to originate from the University of Edinburgh, where McMaster was a student. Additionally, Abunimah and Doherty note that Paula Brooks of the blog Let's Get Real, where Amina frequently posted, had no evidence of existence outside that particular blog.
Yeah, so some listeners may argue here that not being present online is not necessarily evidence of a false persona as such. But in this day and age, it's practically impossible to exist without having some digital fingerprint, so to speak. Almost everyone has left some evidence of their existence across the internet, so being in one blog is definitely a red flag.
After the Electronic Intifada article, Tom McMaster confirmed to the publication what the journalist had suspected. He was, in fact, Amina Arraf. Amina had never existed. She was only a character invented by McMaster to blog about Syria online from the perspective of a Syrian-American lesbian.
I still don't understand what propelled McMaster to create this wholly fictional character to write about Syria. I mean, can't he just write it himself? Like, as himself? Why doesn't he need this new perspective? Is this like a creative writing experiment or something?
As we will go into in the later part of this episode, I think it is very diabolical. I don't know a better term.
Yeah, honestly, it's so deranged.
Though McMaster had been using the Amina Arraf alias for years, he increased his blogging during the beginning of the Syrian uprising to vent opposition to the Assad-led government. Realizing, however, that the Amina character was gaining significant attention, he blogged about her fictional kidnapping in order to remove the persona from public life, eventually planning to write that she was no longer detained, but intended to leave Syria and discontinue blogging.
Yeah, because as we all know, the only way to remove a fictional character from public life is through a very publicized kidnapping.
Right? It really reminds me of the Mantiteo debacle, where he believed that he had a girlfriend who died of cancer, who was not a girl and was not dead.
Yeah, that was very, very disturbing, the whole thing. I really feel bad for him because I don't imagine how he can regain trust after that whole situation.
Well, you actually see it a lot with catfishing, where the person who is doing it realizes it's not sustainable and they have to somehow get rid of this character.
Yeah, so they invent a very convoluted scenario that can justify them disappearing.
So throughout the course of their diligent investigation, journalists also uncovered that Paula Brooks, the creator of the Let's Get Real blog, was also not who she purported to be. Paula was in fact a man, Bill Graber, living in Ohio and blogging as a lesbian.
Jesus Christ, this is like a Russian nesting doll of weird guys pretending to be lesbian.
I mean, the first thing I want to note in our analysis is that plenty of people, specifically trans people, post under accounts in accordance with their gender identity online, and we don't want to disparage these people by suggesting that those who adopt a different gender expression online than they might show in real life are doing so in order to be harmful. Amina's online girlfriend, a woman named Sandra Bagaria who lived in Montreal, was indeed a real person who believed Amina was genuine. Poor Sandra was certainly catfished by Tom McMaster, and if I were Tom's partner, I'd have some serious doubts about our relationship. I think there's more to unpack there than McMaster simply creating a character. He also involved himself in an online relationship with someone.
I mean, doesn't Tom's girlfriend also participate in this ruse? Because I recalled reading somewhere that she was also actively part of this whole charade, or at least, some people claim she is. Which, that being said, I'm also confused as to how Tom can maintain this online relationship. Surely Sandra would have at some point asked for a phone call or a video chat or something. Unless, Tom was adept at using deepfakes.
I mean, people have been catfished before, and I think some people are willing to look the other way when things in their relationship don't totally add up because they don't want to accept that the relationship is fake or failing.
That's really sad. That's really, really sad.
Yeah. So Minal Harjatwala, the writer who Amina/Tom had contacted to review the autobiography manuscript, later told Robert Mackey of the New York Times about the text. Quote, "The faked lesbian sex scenes turn my stomach. The narcissistic writing, the sprinkling of quotations from the Quran and tidbits from Syrian history, the stock stories compiled from 1,000 news clippings, it all seems painfully obvious. So I find myself among the countless people, among them journalists for many, though not all, of the world's most respected news organizations, who today are kicking themselves for believing and trying to help." End quote. The differences between those experimenting or coming out with their gender and simply lying about their life experiences online are obvious in this case. McMaster didn't simply claim to be a woman. He claimed to be a Syrian-American lesbian living in Damascus and blogged about specific experience that he didn't have, including being kidnapped by security forces. Monica Heshy of the Washington Post pens, quoting Liz Henry in part, quote, "The fake existence of Amina Arraf was offensive to bloggers, and to Syrians, and to women, and to lesbians and gays, and to anyone else who has ever been truly marginalized. How irritating that so much attention was given to something ultimately written by a straight American man. And how poignant that a member of one of the most privileged classes in the world felt the only way he could have a voice was to pretend to be a member of a class that had been disenfranchised in every possible way. He's stealing the voice of a marginalized person," says Liz Henry, a web producer at Blogger who had recommended some of Amina's posts. His way of describing what it's like to be gay in the Middle East goes down smooth with people who have a progressive bent. Her appreciation for the posts made her question herself. Why did I jump to this blog? Just because it was a person who shares some of my values? End quote. But I think, in addition to the very correct statement that anyone on the internet could be, well, anyone, there's a more important angle here regarding reporting in Syria in particular. Unfortunately, even sources which claim to be first-person on-the-ground observers can be some guy sitting in his living room in Europe or North America. I've noticed about the Syrian Civil War in particular that so many people want to have a hand in it, want their opinions, whatever those might be, to hold some weight in the great online discussion. But the facts are that there are people in Syria whose lives have been affected, even destroyed or ended by these events, and it's not for us to pretend to have some insight that frankly we could never claim.
Yeah, I mean, the flip side of this observation to me is that personally experiencing an event like the Syrian war doesn't necessarily make someone's views or opinions any more legitimate than someone else. I mean, I'm sure there are plenty of young Syrian men who can provide extensive justifications based on their own so-called lived experiences for joining jihadi militant groups and supporting the expulsion and genocide of Syrian Christians and Alawites. And that those men are Syrian and have been affected by the war doesn't make their views right or valid. Someone sitting on a chair in London articulating a perspective on Syria that advocates for minority rights, secularism, and pluralism is, for me, by far a more legitimate person in terms of, a source of views than some jihadist in Idlib who had seen the Syrian war firsthand, but somehow thinks it's okay to trade Yazidi women slaves for a pack of cigarettes.
No, I completely agree. And I think we have to have actually a broader discussion about what is an opinion. I mean, we are having more conversations about who can have an opinion or whose opinion is more valid. And I think in some ways, yeah, you shouldn't speak on things that frankly you could know nothing about. But Tom McMaster can have an opinion as Tom McMaster. I might think, okay, he's a white guy in Edinburgh, I don't care, but he can have an opinion.
Yeah, I mean, if he was confident enough of his perspective, surely he'd be able to present it as himself. The fact that he had to create Amina as a character shows that he was exploiting the sort of lived experience fad, if you will, the lived experience obsession among certain elements of the progressive left to amplify his voice when he realized, I guess, maybe that no one would have listened to him otherwise.
Right. And it should beg the question as well, whose quote unquote lived experiences do we hear? Because if you live in Syria and you only speak Arabic and don't have an international publication that's going to translate for you, well, then your audience is very, very limited. Whereas Tom/Amina's audience was large because he/she was writing in English.
Yeah, exactly. And, things like speaking fluent English are themselves indicators of class in various parts of the world. So that very much reflects a particular socioeconomic position in the country you're looking at.
So even genuine lived experiences are just not weighed equally in publishing.
Yeah, exactly.
The Caliphate podcast by Rukmini Callimachi similarly represents how shoddy reporting and fact-checking on the region can result in misinformation. Callimachi took a Canadian citizen at his word that he'd been an ISIS fighter, but as it was later revealed, his story was a hoax and one that was published in a New York Times award-winning audio podcast.
Oh, that shit was fucking hilarious. He turned out to be this college dropout working in his family's shawarma shop in Mississauga, and having this really weird fantasies about, being part of ISIS as an apparatus. And this entire story is so funny, we should do an entire episode on that scam, because it genuinely rules. And I recall he provided very vivid detail to Callimachi about beheading people specifically. And, it was all made up, which is very disturbing.
Yeah, it's a super bizarre case. The fact is, I read lots of different reports about what's actually happening in Syria, and I'm uncertain of most of them. A gay girl in Damascus represents how an individual, or perhaps a couple with a political agenda, could create headline-grabbing news about Syria. It was all too easy for McMaster to push the right buttons, to bait readers into falling for Amina's story. He manipulated not only the people he corresponded with as Amina, but those who shared genuine empathy and solidarity for the Syrian people and queer people globally.
Yeah, I think this also shows the flaws of trusting someone's voice solely based on some assemblage of oppressed identities they claim to be. Going on my previous analysis, I'm sure McMaster believed his views on Syria would be more widely accepted if they filtered through the Amina persona, and in a way, this entire story proved he was right, which to me highlights the complete intellectual decay among some segments of the left, where particular views aren't assessed on their own merits. And I see this as a symptom of the balkanization of discourse, where someone has to be a particular concoction of intersectional oppressed identities to be allowed to discuss a given issue. And the end result of this sort of lived experiences approach to politics, because, I am friends with dozens of people here in Canada who may have not set foot in Bahrain at all, but I think their analysis of Bahraini politics and, Gulf politics is miles more legitimate and accurate than many Bahrainis I know who were born and raised there, but their political analysis is lacking in many ways, or at least, reactionary. And I think we should take people's analyses on their own. Like, yes, who says something matters and reflects a particular story, but the analysis itself should be judged on its intellectual grounds, not identitarian grounds.
I completely agree with you. And reading a book about something or spending a long time Studying something is analysis. Yes, you cannot claim lived experience. That is something separate. But it doesn't mean you just popped out of the ground like a mole to say something.
Yeah, exactly.
As far as Benjamin Doherty at Electronic Intifada has been able to uncover, Tom McMaster hasn't faced any real consequences for his deception. He was able to stay on as a graduate student at the University of Edinburgh and never suffered any legal repercussions. Meanwhile, LGBT activists are organizing and campaigning in Syria. Millions of refugees and internally displaced persons are wondering what is the next step for them. Large parts of the country are only recently recovering from domination by the brutal Islamic State. We wanted to begin our Syria section of our Arab Uprising series to highlight the difficulties of crafting a podcast about Syria. Amr and I don't claim to be unbiased. Amr openly discusses his experiences as a Bahraini during the uprising, and I worked in the Burj al Barajna camp in South Beirut with Palestinian and Syrian refugee children, so I admit my view has been duly influenced. But we are asking you to view every report with skepticism, including ours. Look over source material, search for analyses by different outlets, and see what you can find. We're not trying to sound like conspiracy theorists, but simply curious and critical thinkers who don't swallow any party line without serious inquiry. On a closing note, I want to contrast the experience of Amina Arraf, the fictional blogger, with that of Sarah Hegazi, the lesbian activist who killed herself in June 2020 after detention and torture by the Egyptian regime. Sarah was indeed a real human being, one who paid a horrible price for living authentically in a state which persecuted her for simply existing. And it's crucial that hoaxes and unsubstantiated anecdotes don't overshadow activists like Sarah, who stood up to an oppressive regime.
It's a depressing episode to begin with, but then again, that's Syria. And we'll have more episodes about Syria coming up. So if you enjoy this content, please check us out on patreon.com/dascriminal. Bonus episodes this month was just published about Sarah Everard's death and similar cases. And if you sign up on Patreon, you get access to our archive of previous bonus episodes. And if you want to follow us, please check out our Instagram at dascriminalpod and reach out to us if you have any comments about this episode.
We do post photos on Instagram relative to the cases, but we will not be posting photos of poor Jelena Lecic because we're not going to engage in this catfishing exercise.
Yeah, also it's very legally dubious.
Do not purge this episode from memory because we are working on a very exciting future episode about the same case.
Yeah, we're very excited to release that one.
Syria continues next week, so join us as we examine how an uprising spiraled into a full-scale civil war and map out the belligerents in that war.
Until next time, everyone. Bye-bye.
Bye.